Could I get your name?
John Franklin Phillips.
What year were you born and where were you
I was
born?
born September 3rd, 1942 in the little town of Palestine, Texas. I actually lived on a farm about 15 miles from Palestine in the suburb of Natchez, Texas. We grew up on that farm until I left and went to college in 1959.
What was your childhood like? Both parents, siblings?
Yes, there were 7 of us, and my parents were school teachers, and so education was very prominent in all of their discussions with us. It was just automatically assumed that we were going to go to college. So as I was picking cotton in the local farms in the area, and tomatoes and peas and corn, I knew that I was just passing through, and that someday I would, my hope was that I would not be picking the cotton, I would own the cotton fields. And by the grace of God, today I own those cotton fields. So God has blessed me beyond my deeds, and much of my goal right now is to give back, especially to the young kids who were not as fortunate as I to have come up in a double family, mother and father. And that has somehow disadvantaged them, although it certainly has not made it impossible for them to achieve. I know of any number of people who have come from broken families that have done extraordinarily well. So that's not an excuse. But to the extent that I can reach out and help those who are struggling, that's part of my goal in life.
You went to college relatively young, is that correct?
Yes, I started college when I was 15, turned 16 shortly thereafter. I had the advantage of actually going to preschool, although it wasn't recognized as that then. I was not able to stay home with a babysitter. We couldn't afford a babysitter, so my parents would take me to school, and I would sit in the corner of the classroom coloring, but I was also understanding a lot of things that were happening. I still recall that when I was about 4 or 5 years old, sitting in the geometry class that my father taught and learning about side angle side SAS equals SAS and congruency. And that says a lot about the ability to go to preschool. So I knew much of that when I finally got into geometry. It was almost second nature for me. So I'm a big proponent of education, and I'm a real big proponent of preschool in terms of positioning one to achieve academic excellence.
What was your major in college?
I had a double major in chemistry and biology. My plan was to be a doctor, and since I was about 5 or 6 years old, that's all I ever wanted to be. So my studies were geared toward pre-med, and I completed much of my education to get accepted into medical school at Jarvis Christian College in Hawkins, Texas, which I owe quite a debt to. In fact, I currently sit on their board. I describe Jarvis as a small college of academic giants because they really gave me a phenomenal background. I then applied for several medical schools. It was about $15 to apply for medical school, and I didn't have a lot of money. Make a lot of money picking cotton. So I was able to apply to several schools. I was accepted at Southwest Medical School. And thanks to 2 of my professors at then North Texas State University, Dr. System and Dr. York. And when I went down to accept my scholarship, for some reason, all of the money had disappeared. Quite frankly, they assumed that I was white because North Texas State had just integrated. But I didn't let that stop me. I went out and joined the Air Force, took the Air Force officer qualifying test, and went on to become a lieutenant after completing officer training school.
Was that difficult?
Officer training school was a certainly different experience for me. There were things that the kids, being the only black in the class, they were exposed to a lot of things that simply weren't part of my core experience growing up in the cotton fields. But I was able to overcome all of that academically. Culturally, it certainly was a challenge. But I was even able to, let me call it, become bicultural and enjoyed enjoyed the experience. There were just a lot of terms that were being used in that culture that I did not understand, but I learned to understand them. And I certainly learned not to use those that were considered derogatory, and that too was a learning experience for me. So in the Air Force, I went through navigator training, although I qualified for both pilot training and navigator training, but the only slot that was open was navigator training. So I completed navigator training at James Conley Air Force Base in Waco, Texas. From there, went on to Roswell, New Mexico, and was a navigator on KC-135 aircraft. That took me to Vietnam, which I thoroughly enjoyed, flying in support of our troops there, refueling aircraft that were going into Bum, north of the Red River. And I also was able to parlay that into pilot training. So after Vietnam, I went to pilot training and did well enough to stay on as an instructor pilot. So I did that for 3 years, thoroughly enjoyed it. And I was pleased to say that I never lost a student that I trained, got them all through pilot training, even those that were a little
slow.
A little slow about picking up flying skills. And part of my challenge was to give them the confidence and the knowledge to be safe and competent pilots. And I did that and thoroughly enjoyed it. I then, from pilot training, I went off to graduate school, got a degree in logistics management at the Air Force Institute of Technology, and in a number of other schools throughout my career. University of Southern California School of Aerospace Engineering.
Was it difficult to maintain the balance between work and school?
It was not extremely difficult. The most difficult thing was the travel and not being around my young family of 4 at that time. They were in their formative years, but my wife was an extraordinary person in terms of taking them to all of the events that they needed to participate in and being engaged in the school. And I'm a big proponent of parents being engaged in schools because if not, your kids can fall by the wayside. And I would have to say that my kids were in an integrated system, and very often, because of cultural differences, the white teacher's expectation of minority kids is such that they can fall by the wayside or get funneled into special ed. But my wife was on top of things, and so all of my kids stayed on the college track and were able to go off and complete college and doing quite well. And again, that's thanks to my wife's involvement in the school system.
So, how long were you in the military for?
I was in the military for almost 27 years, and my last job was commander at McClellan Air Force Base in Sacramento, California. And it was during that tour that I managed to meet President Clinton on 4 occasions and briefed him on some of the things that we were doing, such as boron neutron capture therapy, working with the University of California, Davis, where we were providing a neutron source. And he thought that that was a great idea. We referred to it as tech transfer. So he asked me if I would join his staff as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense to further expand this notion of technology transfer. And I, of course, was happy to do that. And I resigned my job as commander and became Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Logistics in the Clinton administration. And I was pleased to work with Air Force, Army, Navy, and Marine Corps in implementing a lot of privatization of non-core activities, and got to tour all of the military bases and even got to drive a tank. And it's interesting that I, as a fighter pilot, was a little apprehensive about driving a tank at full speed, especially over hills. But I did it well enough that they gave me a tank driver's license, which I cherish. But it was quite a good experience.
What was the most difficult time about your time in the military?
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that I had to do when I was going through pilot training was to float for 20 minutes. And I was not able to do that. That's the only thing I've ever flunked in my entire life. And the time now is 1970, and of course, in the 1960s, we did not have swimming pools for African Americans. And so it was quite an embarrassing thing for me not to be able to swim like all of my other white colleagues. And one friend that I knew extremely well, and I could speak freely with him, I said, we didn't have swimming pools. He found it shocking that we didn't have swimming pools in my neighborhood. I said, no, I grew up in segregated America, and so swimming was not a part of our core competency. So he had a very different appreciation for my abilities based on the restrictions that we had. So that was probably one of the more difficult times. Again, flunking something for the first time in your life, used to making all A's and a B here and there. So that was a big point of failure for me.
What was one of the most enjoyable times for the military experience?
Going through pilot training again, my instructor was a gentleman who later became a 3-star General, John Fairfield. I was fortunate enough to get him as my pilot, and he grew up in an environment where he had interacted with African Americans, and so he had no apprehensions at all about training me and teaching me, and his expectations, which were quite high. So because of him, I didn't wash out, as was the case with most African Americans at that point in time. I graduated at the top of the class, and so to this day, Lieutenant General John Fairfield is responsible for a lot of my success in the military.
How did you feel when you retired from the military?
It was sad. I had made a lot of friends, and those are friends for life, and I still stay in touch with a lot of them. And it's a fraternity, and I use that term cautiously because at that time it was predominantly male. So it was a very strong fraternity, and I am glad to see that women are assuming their prominent position of leadership, not only in the military, but in the government as well. And just as an aside, I'm one who thinks that there will never be any semblance of peace and stability in the world until more women have assumed positions of responsibility. And I think they will be the savior for much of what is happening in this world.
What did you do after you retired from the military?
After the military, again, I was a political appointee, Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Logistics. I did that for 4 years under the Clinton administration, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I still stay in touch with many of the people I dealt with in that position. I then became Vice President of Honeywell, a job that I enjoyed very much. I was in the Phoenix area. Thoroughly enjoyed working with Honeywell. I then discovered that I could be bought, so Home Depot put enough money on the table that I left Honeywell and became Vice President of Home Depot of their Government Solutions Group, and we actually established that organization. And we got into the government business. Our biggest contract was a $1.7 billion contract. We wound up in New York at the military post up there and providing parts for the military housing, which was being privatized. And I thoroughly enjoyed that job as well. So I then decided it was time to get out and start my own consulting business, and I did that. I established Phillips Defense Consulting, and I've been doing that now for the last 6 years. And I work with many companies and countries. I work with the government of Somalia. I work with Iraq, Iran, and other companies. Some work with IBM and some of the Fortune 500 companies.
Do you have any wisdom that you would like to give to the future generations or to a younger you?
Yes. First of all, you've got to be prepared. Education is the key. For any country to advance, you've got to have an educated populace. You've also got to understand when to compromise. If you are totally intractable in your position, the first thing that's going to happen is if you don't achieve your first goal, you probably are going to be lost for life. So you've got to have a fallback position. You've got to be flexible enough to recognize that second chance, a second opportunity. And very often you have to create that opportunity yourself. So I would strongly advise that. I would also advise the young African American males, you are an endangered species. And one of the things, and this is a political comment, and I make no apologies for it, our privatized system of prisons is designed to make money. And you are the source of finance for most of these privatized prisons. And unfortunately, that started happening when I was in the Clinton administration, and he recognizes that mass incarceration was one of his mistakes, and he has apologized for it. So that is he, President Clinton. So I would say to young African Americans, recognize that there are traps out there, and many of them are designed to capture you. It's ethnic cleansing by any other term. So be cautious, be prepared, be educated. And your opposing gang is not your enemy. It is an institutionalized system that is your enemy. Wise up and stop looking at each other as enemies, but join together as each other and beat that system that's designed to incarcerate you under ethnic cleansing.
Amazing. Anything else you want to add to this in any way?
I am always open to advice, so anyone that wants to reach out to me, I'm more than happy to.
Do you have an email that they could contact you at?
Yes, I'm at jp3144@verizon.net.
Thank you very much for this interview. I appreciate you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.